Welcome to FO Podcasts. With me is Martin MacLeod. He's an author. He retired from the BBC, covering Africa. He also runs half marathons at a fast clip. Naturally, he's thrilled by South Africa's victory in the World Cup. He is South African, but he now lives in very pleasant bourgeois surroundings in London. Welcome to FO Podcasts, Martin.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be with you.
Thank you. Martin, one of the topics we've been discussing has been this recurrence of coups in Africa. And since you've covered Africa for so many decades, paint us a picture of what is going on.
Well, there are many things that have come together at the same time. And that is why there's no single easy to encapsulate answer to the question of the coups. But you're absolutely right. There've been, in the last 50 years, there've been just in excess of 100 coups in Africa. And if you take that against the rest of the world, there've only been 250. So you can see Africa has had far more than its fair share of coups.
And many of them have succeeded recently.
Indeed, they have. But the point is that they really represent, apart from a few outliers, one particular strand of Africa. And that, in a sense, is the interconnection between the Sahel, which goes all the way from Mauritania to Somalia, and the rest of Africa. And it also is along the divide, which is the Arab-African divide and the Muslim-Christian divide. Now, that's only one element of all of this, but it does sort of show you that there is probably some kind of tension there. It's one the African Union doesn't like talking about, because the African Union, of course, represents the whole of Africa, all its 54,
I believe.
Yes, depends how you count them, states that are part of Africa. But that is one element in it.
I see. So explain that element a bit more, because there is, of course, North Africa, which is almost entirely Muslim, all the way from Morocco to Egypt. Then comes the Sahel. And then below that, most of Africa is largely Christian.
No, that's right.
And the Sahel is where the two meet.
Exactly. Of course, you missed out the Sahara in the middle, but yes,
between
North Africa and the Sahel is
exactly. It's the Sahara. That's
yes.
true. That's true. But not very many people live there. It's a harsh, huge desert. There are some roving bands and
there are
ethnic
indeed
groups, but it's a harsh life in the Sahara.
Very harsh, but it has never been the barrier that everybody sort of assumes it to be, that I certainly would assume it to be. It has always been somewhere where people came and went, and where there have been trade routes. I mean, the trade routes go back centuries.
Of course.
And not just along the Nile, but across the whole of the Sahara. There have been massive trade routes. And who did they take? Now, this is the key point, is that they brought salt, gold, and slaves. And it was the slave element, in a sense, which underlines the relationship between the North and the South, between the Arab world and the Christian world. And that, in a sense, is one of the divides. Now, of course, that only came about after the arrival of Islam, which crossed the whole of North Africa, after about 700 AD. And so that is after that period, you have Berbers, particular, who drive downwards through ancient Mali, Ghana, and the Sokoto Empire. And the Moroccans defeated the Sokoto Empire. It was crushed. And in a sense, out of that relationship comes this long slaving pattern, which also is replicated on the Nile itself.
Excellent. So the coups are in part because of that divide. And explain to me then, how does it manifest itself in the modern post-colonial so-called nation states all along the Sahel?
Well, in a sense, the thing that happened after that slave trade, of course, was the construction of the modern system of Africa and the African states, which were colonial creations.
Yeah. The Gambia famously makes no sense.
Exactly.
along the river.
Exactly.
A sliver along the river.
Yeah, it's a tiny English or British colony. Both sides are French, of course. You're absolutely
exactly.
right. And but Nigeria, Ghana, all the other states were in a sense creations of the British, the French, the Germans, or whoever it was that was, or the Portuguese, of course.
Yeah.
And out of those, in a sense, it comes the relationship between the people who gained power at independence in the 1960s, who were mostly people who had relationships with the West,
mm-hmm.
and the people that they looked down upon and who didn't benefit from the system were people from the North. And that produced, in a sense, a replication of the North-South Christian-Muslim trade. Because don't forget also, after the 1450s and the arrival of the Portuguese off the coast of Senegal and the beginning of European slavery, of course, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of Africans were then taken, many of them from the north, through Africa, through the Christian bits of the colonies, and off to America. So slavery takes place in two directions. It goes north with Arabs taking Christians previously, but then it, in a sense, reverses, and the opposite happens with a lot of Muslims being taken. For example, the Sokoto Caliphate exports perhaps 175,000 people, mostly Muslims, to Baha'i in Brazil.
On a largely unknown feature of the story. How does that pertain to, say, Niger, where there's been a coup, a successful coup, and of course, other neighboring Francophone countries where there have been coups? So how does all of this play out today? Is it just an ambitious, strong man from a particular ethnic group wresting power because politicians are corrupt? Is it very powerful ethnicities in the military seizing power when they get a chance? Is it just random? What is going on?
Well, it's all of those things. But the reality is that what you tend to have is that one family, ethnic group, tribe, if you like, grabs power and then holds on forever. I mean, the Bongo family in Gabon held power for 56 years.
That's true.
I mean, that is one heck of a long time. And
almost as bad as the Nehru family in India.
I leave that to you. But the problem was that if you hold on to power indefinitely and refuse to share power either with people outside your family or outside of your ethnic group, in a sense, what you say to the rest of the country is, well, the only thing you can do is turn to any other institution, and the other institution generally is the army, because your own family can't be bothered to go and sit in some godforsaken military post in the middle of nowhere month after month after month. They want to enjoy the high life. So generally, the army has not come from the ruling family.
Yeah. So what happens is that the first generation chap is a street dog and fights his way to power. Then his children and grandchildren become poodles who live in palaces. And another street dog comes around and chews up the palace poodle.
Exactly. You have it in one. That is exactly what happens. So that is the second relationship. Yeah. So the first one is the North-South tension. The second one is the idea of entitlement, that you can hold on to power indefinitely.
Yeah.
And then the third one really is the way in which the French reinforced both of these tendencies. The British basically, when colonialism came, they left. They left Africa, and they said to Africa, "It's up to you. You must do what you like." The French did not. They basically had a process of where you could become a citizen, a French citizen, if you were a member of the elite and had the right educational processes and the right standing in society, you could become a French citizen, and it gave you completely different status. And people operated in that way for a long, long time.
And the French football team is fundamentally Africans who became French citizens and ended up living in France and now represent France.
Exactly. And the problem was, of course, that meant that in a sense, exacerbated the other tensions and divisions that there were in society, because people then thought, not only are you being controlled by an elite, we're being controlled by an elite which is, in a sense, answerable to Paris and not answerable to us. So there was a deep underlying discontent with what happened.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned France, because France, even after the collapse of its empire, continued a shadow empire, an informal empire. And France controlled monetary policy. France still held the commanding heights of the economy in many of these Francophone countries. And now the French seem to be on the back foot, and it is Russian mercenaries who are taking their place. Well, so what's going on there?
Well, that's the next stage in all of this. Of course, there were tensions during the Cold War, because everybody fought out. There was a huge fight in Africa between the Americans and the Russians, or the Soviets, as it was then.
Yeah.
But in a sense, this has been replicated now and has been renewed under Putin, who looked to the Wagner Group as a cheap and cheerful way of exercising power in Africa, as they have in Ukraine. And there were only perhaps 1,000 of them. But in the right circumstances, with the right equipment and the right backing, they did well. Now, of course...
And they're all the way from Mali to Central African Republic.
Indeed they are.
And there are Africans on streets waving Russian flags.
But there's an interesting point about that.
Yeah.
Now, two things have happened since then. The first thing is, of course, that the Wagner Group is no longer active. Prigozhin, who was the head of it, was killed in the helicopter crash.
No, plane crash, private jet, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. You know, which was, shall we say, unexplained, or we have a fair idea.
It was completely an accident, Martin.
Of course it was. How can I possibly think that it was anything else? After he challenged Putin himself, he marched on Moscow, and that was the end of him.
It's just a happy coincidence, just as one of the
unhappy coincidence. Surely, I mean, we can't wish death on him. Anyway,
happy for Putin.
Yes, Vladimir. Very happy for Putin. And since then, there are now two other groups that he has put in its place. The one is called Redat, and it was founded in 2008 by Russian paratroopers and is much closer to the Russian intelligence. So he's, in a sense, taken the Wagner Group in-house, and there was a recent ad, I believe, which said, "Wagner is the past. If you're really interested in real work in Africa, then the Ministry of Defense and Redat PMC is your choice." So that's on the 18th of August. It was posted. So you see, they are now involved, but they're not just involved at the level of putting boots on the ground. There's another whole parallel industry that is not well understood.
So talk to us about that parallel industry, as I understand it from some of my friends, particularly French friends who have spent a long time in Africa, is that Russians are training local troops, Russians are infiltrating various different positions. In a way, they say this is the privatized, more efficient model of the Soviet playbook. It's almost as if the Soviets decided we can't do it ourselves, so let's have a modern-day British East India Company.
Exactly.
Robert Clives.
Exactly. That's exactly what's happening. But there's something else that I wanted to highlight, which is that alongside the hard guys, there's then another whole set of operations which go on, which are at the level of internet, playbook, Twitter, Instagram, and all the others. And these are mostly outsourced to Africans, to Nigerians and Ghanaians, who are then paid to put up the appropriate message in an African context. And of course, they're superb at doing it. I mean, anyone who's ever been tried to be scammed by a Nigerian to extract money from them, and if you haven't, I don't know, you've probably never been on the internet.
No, I have had that fortunate experience.
Well, exactly.
It's a good education.
It's a very good education. They're very good at it.
Yeah.
So they use the same skills in a sense, just now working for Putin. He pays, and it's outsourced to them.
So, just very quickly, my co-author, Glenn Carl, who retired from the CIA, thinks Surkov, I think his name is Vladislav Surkov, the man who has mastered the dark arts of the internet and basically Putin's spin doctor, and the doctor of misinformation, really. He thinks he is one of, Glenn thinks that Surkov is one of the most influential people of our era. And it's frightening that not enough Westerners have studied him.
I think you're right. And that is because what is happening, as I say, in parallel with the hard guys, is this disinformation campaign, which is being run. And it is being seen in Africa, and it uses all the most modern, the most appropriate systems of dissemination. And when you see
Facebook,
young men,
YouTube,
all of those,
WhatsApp, the whole shebang.
And when you see young people on the streets of Niger, it's not necessarily because they think that Russia is a great idea. Most of them wouldn't even be able to put it on a map. But they have been told through their social media internet connections that this is the answer, that the French should be replaced by the Russians, and the Russians will bring them happiness and joy.
Ah, I see. Indira Gandhi thought that.
Well, a rather different environment, yes.
The Russians probably did bring her joy.
Right.
Excellent. So much so for this extraordinary operation that the Russians are carrying out, marrying both the Iron Fist and the Velvet Glove. What does this mean for Africa? Are the French going to be pushed out? Are we now going to see basically a Russian-dominated Sahel, or not necessarily a Russian-dominated, but a Russian-influenced Sahel?
I think we will see a Russian-influenced Sahel, and I think it will continue for a long time.
A long time, meaning 10, 20 years?
Oh, yes, easily.
I see.
And will be it's well entrenched. But I think that there is something else that will happen, which is, of course, as usual, Africa will, in the end, envelop and gobble up everybody. Nobody succeeds in Africa except Africans. So I assume in the end it will fail, because I don't think you can control a continent like Africa. It's far too complex.
Absolutely.
But the other side of it is that there may be some benefits, there may be some nations that do well, but the big loser in this entire system, apart from the West, has been the African Union. Because don't forget that the African Union established a system of standby brigades, which were, there's one in East Africa, one West Africa, one Southern Africa, and they have been trained, they're well trained and financed by the Americans essentially. Yep. And they could have been deployed. And the Nigerians said that they would not tolerate another coup in Africa. Well, I mean, I'm afraid we've had loads now. We've had Niger, we've had Gabon,
Burkina Faso, I believe.
Exactly. And the problem is that the Nigerians, frankly, have decided not to act.
Why? Why have the Nigerians decided not to act, and why can't the African Union act? And why are these brigades lying idle?
I think that really you have to, in a sense, ask yourself the question. To get an answer, you get it in a slightly different context. Why is there only one war that was ever fought by the United Nations? And that was the Korean War.
1953.
Exactly. And the only
52-53, sorry.
The only reason that it happened was because the Soviet Union walked out of the Security Council and the United States got it through. Ever since then, it's always been blocked. And that, in a sense, shows you why you can't run these operations multilaterally. The African Union has exactly the same problems, that they have so many divisions because, yes, there may be a majority of African states that would be in favor of this. There's always going to be somebody who says, no. Not in my backyard.
And they veto it.
Yeah, and they just won't go along with it. And I think the Nigerians also thought that, yes, they did manage to go in Sierra Leone and Liberia in the past, and they managed to do quite a good job, to be absolutely honest. through ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States.
Yeah.
But I think they feel that there are too many states which have now gone on to the other side. They can't act in all of them. They would be overstretched. Their people would be defeated. And don't forget, they're fighting an enormous insurgency in the north of their country with Boko Haram.
Yeah, I was just about to say that Nigeria itself is stretched.
Yeah.
And Nigeria is facing political divisions as well. So it's difficult for a coherent policy to emerge.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, it's easier to talk about a Nigerian division than Nigerian unity. Yeah. I mean, they do all support their football team. That's about where it ends. And, you know, there's such large and difficult state to deal with. I think every president, you know, hangs on by his fingernails. And I think it has only always been a man, to be honest.
That's true. So you said Africans will suffer because of this intervention. In what way? Because, again, some of my friends have been telling me, both Africans and the French, that some of these coups are popular, including the coup in Niger.
Well, I tried to explain that in the way about the social media issue, but I'm not suggesting they aren't.
Okay.
But, you know...
Because of the propaganda that the Russians put out. So people basically think these are in our interest.
Exactly.
And therefore, you know, they're misinformed.
But in a sense, you know, what has most African states actually delivered, especially for their young people? I mean, they've nothing. No, there is hardly a state really you can rely on. There aren't any jobs. Agriculture has been allowed to decline. So what have they got to lose, in a sense? They reckon the current system is a failure. Well, let's try something else. But let me just go on to another example, which is the situation in Sudan. Where
very important.
Exactly, where the RSF, the Rapid Support Force, and Hemeti, who is, in a sense, was based in the far west and in Chad, is now on the offensive. He looks as if he's going to take over Darfur. He looks as if he's going to take control of Khartoum. I don't think that the army has much control in Khartoum any longer at all. They are losing positions in the west. They've moved their headquarters to Port Sudan.
Oh, that's basically retreat, really.
Absolutely.
They are bang on the sea so that they can jump on a boat and leave.
Exactly. And the question is, who, in a sense, is on which side? And you begin to see how these things have worked out. Now, it wasn't a coup. There was a coup earlier in Sudan, but this wasn't a coup. It's just a straightforward fight between two generals. And
it's civil war.
It is. And on the one hand, you have the army led by al-Burhan, and he looks to Egypt and the United States and maybe to the Saudi Arabia. And on the other hand, you have Hemeti, who looks to the United Arab Emirates, and he looks to the Wagner Group and Putin, who have been using the gold that he extracts from the mines in the area that he controls, and it helps Putin fund his Ukrainian war effort. The gold is flown out via Syria. It was well documented by various American newspapers. The New York Times did a fantastic job on this. So did CNN. They have shown these relationships, and it is now looks as if this is really paying big dividends for Putin and for Hemeti, and that he's going to be the one who will come out on top. He may, in fact, be the next leader of Sudan. And then what will Africa do about this? Somebody controlled, or at least highly influenced by outside powers.
So here's a question. Why is the US losing? This is the world's biggest economy. This is a country with 800 military bases. When I visited even Rwanda, there were US Army officers in some conference. So the whole place seems to crawl with the US military officers flying in, flying out, supposedly improving the security of the continent. Why is the US-led West on the back foot?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think that they actually have 800 military bases. They have...
Not around the world.
Yes, but even that is I think, is too strong. I think that they have a far smaller number of proper bases, but they have relationships and places where they can leave things, and they do have a few offices, but not really a base in the
not
way that we would
800,
understand.
but they have 800 locations around the world, for sure.
That's absolutely true. They used to call them lily pads, for goodness sake, as if there were a frog that was going to jump between them. The Americans have always had one tendency, which is, to hell with the outside world. We are America. Why do we need anybody else? And that's still strong.
So that goes back ages ago, right to the earliest days of the Republic. And of course, it has resurfaced time and again. Woodrow Wilson negotiated to not a large degree, but to a considerable degree, the Treaty of Versailles, and thought of the League of Nations, and even promised Armenia a big state, much bigger than the Armenia of today. And all of that was lost because immediately when he returned, Congress lost interest.
Exactly. And that look how long it took them to get into the Second World War. They were very reluctant to do that.
Yeah.
And that is a whole tendency. In a sense, Trump represents that as well, because he has said, why are we getting involved in Ukraine? I mean, he has his own problems with Putin, who probably has a hold over him through, shall we say, some of the honey trap pictures that he took of Trump when he was in Moscow. So there's a whole relationship there that wishes to see a declining impact and cost to the American taxpayer. It's a sort of to hell with the rest of the world. We're a big enough country on our own, worry about our own borders, worry about our own people. The rest of the world can go to hang and look, and we're not going to be their policemen any longer. And I think that is one tendency that it has, in a sense, undermines everything that Biden has been trying to do. And he's very engaged with the world, and that's one of his great strengths. And I think he's done a good job with difficult circumstances. But Africa could lose out because the West is just not that engaged anymore. France is pulling out. The Brits have almost nothing left in Africa. And the Americans are, shall we say, reluctant to be engaged.
And the Russians are giving it more time, focus, and energy.
On the cheap. I mean, these are small companies. The Wagner Group and Redat are both, in a sense, private enterprises that they can work through. It's a cheap and cheerful way of having your own your ends. In a sense, it goes back to the sort of Elizabethan age when privateers, exactly. Mm-hmm. Walter Raleigh and people like that Queen Elizabeth gave the green light to and said, you go and conduct my foreign policy for me.
And robbed Spanish galleons.
I don't know what you're talking about.
The silver from Latin America, which the Spanish are robbing from the natives, you rob them from the Spaniards.
Exactly. They somebody else dug it up, somebody else stole it, so we'll steal it back.
Exactly. It's funny, you're the second person who is mentioning this. Another person was talking about it, but he, shall we say, is in the UN and is involved in peacekeeping operations. And obviously he was speaking off the record. But he said, our UN peacekeeping forces are so bureaucratic and they have so much red tape that they are useless. And a few Wagner Group people, when they show up, they get results. And they're just efficient. They may not, obviously, be nice and cuddly and human rights be damned. But there's no gainsaying the fact that they are effective.
Well, of course, the United Nations has no troops. They only have troops that they borrow from other states.
Yeah.
I mean, I visited...
But they're there in Congo still, next to Rwanda.
I know, I visited Indian and Pakistani troops in eastern Congo, mm-hmm. and we were following one story, which was frankly how the Indian troops were selling weapons and ammunition to the rebels for gold, and they were the rebels they were supposed to be suppressing. And they did a great trade.
Pakistanis weren't doing that?
Of course they did it too. I'm just saying we came across the Indians who were doing it. And when we raised this with the Indian officers, they were very upset about it. And the United Nations was even more upset because they have nobody else to turn to.
Mm-hmm. So given that reality, what does this mean, let's say, for Sudan, which already has now become two countries, Sudan and South Sudan? What does this mean for Sudan? Because I'm sure this is round one. Surely the ethnic groups that have been ousted in the current civil war won't sit silent forever.
They won't, and again, it is a replication of what I was talking about earlier with the Arab-African split. I mean, Hemeti sees himself as an Arab. His whole relationship goes back to Colonel Gaddafi and the Libyans who established the group out of which he came, and the group that they are.
And the Libyans did act very decisively when it came to African matters. Gaddafi took a great interest.
Absolutely, he did. And the people that Hemeti are killing are the Masalit, who are Africans.
So does this mean that Sudan may break up even further? It's already broken up. Does it mean Sudan breaks up into its constituent parts?
I'm not going to go around predicting the future. I think that's madness. It's impossible. One can't know. You can point to the current tensions, and this is possible. But
who knows?
Who knows? I mean, this is it's not possible to predict.
So economically, then, with all this violence, trade will suffer, investment will suffer. There will be fewer jobs. What happens to other things? The Sahel is also short on water. In fact, some people say the spike in violence is because there is a pressure on resources. 90% of Lake Chad is now dry.
All of these things are true. And none of this helps the growth in Africa. And, there were these great plans to build this green wall across the whole of Africa and plant it and, reforest it, which is desperately needed.
Yeah.
But, all of these things get put on the back foot because who knows who's going to be in power in the country in the next few years.
So population is going up and resources are constrained. And so grim days ahead.
I'm afraid I hate to be a bearer of bad tidings. But the one thing I would always say about Africa is that Africans somehow manage to salvage something out of bad days. And perhaps we should just also look at the African diaspora who send back such huge quantities of money now to Africa, equal to all official aid. And
it exceeds, I'm told.
That's right, in some places. Yeah. And I think that is, perhaps these relationships, we can look to Africans to, in the end, solve their own problems. That's why I think, whether it's the French or the Russians, in the end, everybody will, shall we say, get bogged down in the sands of the Sahara, and it'll be Africans who now survive, who now flourish. And in the long run, I'm still optimistic about the continent.
Well, on that happy note, Martin, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
Bye for now.